Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today we are jumping into one of the biggest questions there is. Is the universe, with all its incredible order, just some kind of cosmic accident? Or is there an intelligence behind it all? We're about to dive into a classic philosophical showdown. Okay, so let's get right into it. The universe isn't just a chaotic mess, right? Gravity works the same way every single day. The speed of light doesn't just change on a whim. Things follow rules, what we call the laws of nature. But the really deep question is, why? Why these laws? For that matter, why are there any laws at all? That's the huge mystery we're going to unpack.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at this idea of a universe of order. Then, we'll get into Richard Swinburne's argument for a designer. After that, we'll bring in the heavy hitter, David Hume, and his powerful objections. Then we'll see how Swinburne fires back with his rebuttal. And finally, we'll zoom out and ask, what even makes a good explanation in the first place?
All right, first things first. Whenever we ask why something happened, it turns out there are really only two basic kinds of explanation we can give. On one side, you've got your scientific explanations. This is where you explain one thing by pointing to a deeper, more fundamental rule. So what does water boil? Well, because of the laws of thermodynamics. It's a chain of laws explaining other laws. But then, on the other side, you have personal explanations. Why do these sentences exist? Well, because I, a person, intended to say them. The explanation is all about the purpose of a thinking agent.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. That scientific explanation method, it has a limit, a hard stop. You can keep explaining one law with a deeper one, and then an even deeper one, but eventually you hit bedrock. You get to the most fundamental laws of physics, and science itself can't tell you why they exist. They just are. And that little crack is where a whole different kind of thinking can get in.
And this is where philosopher Richard Swinburne steps in. He looks at that exact limit of science and says, hey, maybe we need to use that other kind of explanation, a personal one, to make sense of the universe's most basic rules.
Now this is absolutely crucial. Swinburne isn't talking about how perfectly designed a bird's wing is, or how complex the human eye is. That's what you'd call spatial order, the arrangement of parts. No, he's focused on what he calls temporal order. It's the regularity of succession. In other words, the laws of physics themselves, the fact that things happen in predictable, consistent patterns, one after the other. That's the real magic he wants to explain.
So here's how he builds his case, step by step. First, he says, look, our own actions create regular patterns, and the reason is our intentions. Simple enough. Second, the universe runs with this incredible clockwork-like regularity, all thanks to its laws. So he concludes, it makes sense to think, by analogy, that the universe's regularity is also the result of a person-like agent's actions. And remember, we already said science can't explain these laws, so for Swinburne, this personal explanation is the only game in town.
This chart does a fantastic job of laying it all out. See, if you follow the path on the left, that's us. Our intentions lead to regular actions. The middle path shows how science works, explaining laws with deeper laws, until it just stops. Swinburne's big move, over there on the right, is to connect these two. He proposes that the best explanation for that dead end, those fundamental regularities of nature, is a person-like agent who can act on the whole universe.
But not so fast. Swinburne's argument might sound neat and tidy, but it's an updated take on a very old idea. And that idea has a legendary critic, the 18th century philosopher David Hume. And let me tell you, his objections are so sharp, they're still the main challenge to this day.
Hume's core attack is just brilliant. He zeroes in on the analogy itself. He basically says, okay, you want to say the universe is like a human invention. Fine, let's take that seriously. If we do, then the designer must be a lot like a human designer, flawed and limited, not some perfect, all-powerful, infinite God. The analogy, he points out, cuts both ways.
And he just keeps piling on. Look at this list. Our universe has flaws, right? Earthquakes, disease. So the designer isn't perfect. The universe is finite, so why would you assume the designer is infinite? Maybe it wasn't one designer at all. Maybe it was a whole committee of junior gods who botched the job. And he asks, don't all minds we've ever seen have bodies? Don't all designers eventually die? If you follow the logic of the analogy, you end up with a designer that looks nothing like the God most people believe.
So, centuries later, how does Swinburne deal with this absolute barrage of criticism from Hume? Well, he's got some very clever responses that try to patch up the argument.
All right, let's put them head to head. Hume asks, why not many designers? Swinburne pulls out a classic philosophical tool called Occam's razor, which basically says the simplest explanation is usually the best, and one designer is simpler than a team. Hume says a mind needs a body. Swinburne flips that on its head. He says a body is a limitation. It pins you to one spot. A being that acts everywhere at once wouldn't have one. And to the idea that the designer could have died, Swinburne goes back to his key point. A watch has spatial order. It can tick long after its maker is gone. But the laws of nature have temporal order. They are happening right now. They need a cause that is continuously keeping them in existence.
And this all brings us to the final and maybe the deepest part of this whole debate. Because it's not just about the evidence anymore. It's about what we're willing to even count as an explanation.
This is the ultimate counterargument, right? The critic says, wait a minute, you're trying to explain the mystery of an orderly universe by introducing an even bigger mystery, a complex, totally unexplained designer. Are you really solving the problem, or are you just kicking the can down the road?
At the very heart of this is that principle we just talked about, Occam's razor. Do not multiply entities beyond necessity. In plain English, keep it simple. Don't make things more complicated than they have to be. So Hume's side would say that the laws of nature just existing is way simpler than inventing a whole supernatural designer to explain.
But Swinburne has a fantastic comeback for this. He argues that science does this all the time. Physicists saw things they couldn't explain, so they proposed the existence of brand new, totally unseen things like quarks or neutrinos. At first, those new particles were a huge mystery, but they were necessary to explain the data. Swinburne says a designer is exactly like that. A necessary new entity we need to postulate to explain the data we see. A universe that runs on elegant, consistent laws.
And so that's where we land, with this incredible final question. Who is really using Occam's razor correctly here? Is suggesting one single personal cause for all the laws of nature the ultimate simple explanation? Or is just accepting the universe's order as a basic, unexplained fact the simpler, more honest path? It's a question that forces us to think not just about what we explain, but how we explain it. Thanks for joining me.